Welcome to the Midnight Narrator, where every story holds a dark secret and every whisper tells a chilling truth. Tonight's unsettling tale, Full Swing, explores a seemingly innocent day at an amusement park that spirals into a nightmarish ordeal. Sometimes, thrill-seeking brings you closer to your fears than you ever imagined. Are you ready to uncover the mystery that lies beneath the surface? It was a scorcher, a real heatwave day, and I had a rare Tuesday off. Everyone I knew was chained to their desks, so I decided to treat myself to a solo trip to Adventureland, the local amusement park. I'd gone by myself before and always had a good time. I used to be a real thrill seeker, but these days I preferred a more relaxed pace. The most excitement I craved was finding a good parking spot. I arrived around 2 in the afternoon. The park was surprisingly empty even for a weekday. It was a strange feeling, a mix of anticipation at the prospect of short lines and a nagging unease at the sparse crowds. It felt off. I tried to shake it off and headed towards the attractions. Like most people, I preferred to start with the less intense rides and gradually work my way up to the big ones. My personal favorite was a towering pendulum swing ride called the Sky Serpent. It was a bit of a dramatic name, but it delivered a good adrenaline rush. By 7:30, with the park closing at 8, I knew it was time for my final ride. Earlier, while waiting in line for the log flume, I'd met a guy named Ethan. We'd hit it off immediately and decided to hang out for the rest of the day. We'd agreed on every ride until now. He'd suggested ending the night on the Whirlwind, a spinning teacup-style ride, but I'd convinced him to join me on the Sky Serpent. The line for the Whirlwind was ridiculously long, whereas the Sky Serpent was practically empty. As we approached the entrance, the queue was almost deserted. "Think they'll let us go around a few times if it stays this quiet?" Ethan asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. I forced a smile and chuckled. Normally I'd be just as eager, but that nagging feeling in my gut was getting stronger. I really didn't want to ride. I tried to convince myself it was just the fried food I'd eaten earlier. I'm a fairly logical person. I don't usually let anxiety get the better of me. When we joined the queue, there were maybe 50 people ahead of us. After one cycle, only 20 remained. Several families left, saying their kids were tired. By the time we reached the boarding platform, there were only 19 of us. The ride cars held 20 passengers. Multiple rides were a definite possibility. I felt a growing urge to leave, but I didn't want to seem like a spoilsport to Ethan. The time came to board. My heart was pounding. I briefly wondered if rewatching those disaster movies had made me more susceptible to anxiety, but it wasn't a premonition of a specific disaster. It was just a deep sense of wrongness. I did everything I could to rationalize it, but nothing worked. I seriously considered telling Ethan I felt unwell, but we'd had such a good time together, and I didn't want to let him down. We were near the back of the queue and ended up in the third car from the front. At least we weren't in the very first one. As the ride prepared to launch, a recorded voice echoed through the speakers. Higher and higher, the serpent takes flight through the twilight sky into the night. The accompanying orchestral music, which I'd always found a bit over the top, now sounded ominous. Ethan even started humming along, squeezing my arm in anticipation. We settled into our seats, and an attendant came by to secure the individual over-the-shoulder restraints. I'm a larger build, but I've always fit comfortably on rides. This time, the restraint felt unusually tight, pressing uncomfortably against my shoulders and chest. It should have felt secure, but it felt trapping. The attendant returned to the control panel, gave a thumbs up, and shouted, "Ready to soar?" Everyone raised their hands and cheered except me. I just let out a long, shaky breath. I started silently counting down the seconds, trying to distract myself by picturing Ethan and me after the ride, imagining how relieved we'd both be. The operator pressed the button, and we were off. The pendulum swung out of the loading platform with a sudden surge of speed. It began a slow, creaking ascent to its highest point, a stomach-churning drop, followed by a series of disorienting twists, turns, and a massive 360-degree loop. About halfway through the ride, I started to relax a little. I told myself the worst was over. It was just a bit of pre-ride jitters, We were rounding the final curve and a wave of relief washed over me. I could see the loading platform. We were almost done. But the ride didn't begin to decelerate. Usually it started slowing down several hundred feet before the end. It was still going at full speed. A warning light flickered erratically on the control panel, unnoticed by the riders, but not by the staff. A surge had overloaded the braking system, frying a crucial component. As we whizzed past the loading area, I saw the operators exchanging worried glances. I noticed that no one else was waiting in line. Someone in our car yelled, "Another round!" and most of the other riders responded with excited cheers. Everyone except me. Ethan looked at me and squeezed my wrist. "Yes, I knew they'd let us keep going. This is awesome." He let out a whoop of joy as we began the next ascent. He was beaming for the whole of the second lap. We passed the platform again, but this time the operator was joined by several other staff members. The attendant who had secured our restraints looked pale and agitated. As we swung by for our third circuit, the mood on the ride had shifted. Some people were still shouting with excitement, but others were starting to look genuinely scared. Not everyone had noticed the staff's frantic expressions, but I had. We started up the incline again. This was the slowest part of the ride, maybe 10 miles an hour, and it slowed even more as we reached the apex. It gave us a brief window to breathe or try to talk, although it only lasted about 20 seconds. Are we stuck?" I asked Ethan, my voice trembling. "I'm sure it's fine," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "Probably just a minor electrical fault with the braking system. There's always a manual override." His words were cut short as we plummeted down the steep drop. We passed the loading area yet again, this time with more staff looking deeply concerned. Someone was standing close to the path of the swinging pendulum, trying to yell something to us, but we couldn't make out the words over the noise. It sounded like they were saying they were working on getting us off. This time, as we zoomed by, everyone on board was visibly panicking. The reality of the situation seemed to finally be sinking in. We went around a fifth time, and nothing changed. On the sixth pass, we were at the peak of the swing and saw a fire truck pulling into the fairground parking lot. From our vantage point, we had a clear view of the parking area and even a section of the highway beyond. It took 2 more loops for the emergency services to reach the ride, not just firefighters but police officers and ambulances too. Seeing the ambulances sent a fresh wave of fear through me. Was it just standard procedure, or did they know something we didn't? A few minutes later, someone appeared with a large whiteboard, which they used to write messages to us. The ride was too loud to hear anything they shouted. It must have been the 12th or 13th time around when the whiteboard message finally appeared. Trying to secure at peak. I knew they couldn't write a novel in the short time we passed by, but what did that even mean? I guessed they were trying to reassure us they were working on a rescue plan, but it did little to ease my anxiety. We'd been on this ride for nearly 30 minutes, our bodies aching, our stomachs churning. A couple of loops later, we saw a fire truck attempting to position itself beneath the highest point of the swing. Luckily, there was a large enough open area for the truck to maneuver. Unfortunately, at its peak, the swing reached about 200 feet in the air. There were no emergency exits at the top, unlike some other rides. You'd think that would be a basic safety requirement, but what did I know? We watched as the fire truck extended its aerial ladder, but it fell far short of reaching us. We waited, suspended in the air as the firefighters scrambled to find a solution. The crowd below watched us like some macabre spectacle. Nearly 45 minutes into the ordeal, the first tragedy occurred. Then another. Soon after, a thin young man in the carriage behind us had been talking about trying to slip out of his lap bar. The person next to him and I had strongly advised against it. The next time we reached the peak of the swing, he began to writhe and struggle violently, almost rocking the carriage. He managed to partially free himself just as we reached the highest point. It didn't end well. His leg became entangled with a part of the ride's mechanism, and the force of the swing ripped him free from the restraint. His body plummeted to the ground. I didn't see the full impact, but the horrifying scream of the person next to him, combined with the sickening thud, was enough. The scream abruptly cut off, followed by a chorus of terrified cries from the crowd below. The man next to him had suffered a catastrophic medical event, likely brought on by the extreme stress and shock. I could hear the rising tide of moans and sobs from the onlookers. Before, the ride's noise had drowned them out, but now their terror was palpable. Police officers began trying to usher people out of the area, but many remained, some even parking along the side of the road to film the scene with their phones. It was sickening. After an hour on the ride, the screaming and shouting had mostly subsided. A heavy, oppressive silence settled over everyone. It felt like we had all collectively accepted our fate. My nails were digging deeply into Ethan's wrist. My throat was raw from screaming and my voice was almost gone. I saw a small trickle of blood where my nails had broken his skin, but he was too far gone to notice. He, along with several other passengers, were violently ill. He had vomited multiple times and his eyes were unfocused. Around this time, the electricity in the entire park flickered and died. All the lights went out. I assumed they were attempting a hard reset, hoping it would somehow stop the ride. The swing, however, relied not only on gravity but also on powerful motors and other electronic systems. The sudden power loss had triggered a failsafe, designed to prevent uncontrolled movement, but the system itself was damaged from the initial surge, rendering the failsafe useless. Even with the power off, the ride continued its relentless motion. I could hear someone yelling in frustration, trying to understand how it was still moving without power. After 2 hours, they allowed some family members into the loading area. It was a terrible idea. We were doing our best to remain calm, but seeing our loved ones watching us, screaming and crying as we swung past every 2 minutes, made the situation infinitely worse. My sister was the first of my family to arrive. I love her dearly, but she's incredibly stubborn and demanded that something be done, even though the emergency responders had clearly tried everything they could. Her distress, while born of love, only amplified my own. The firefighters had positioned a large safety net beneath the highest point of the swing. It was still a terrifyingly long drop, even if we could somehow manage to get out of the moving carriages and land on it. The memory of what had happened to the man who had tried to escape earlier was still fresh in everyone's minds. The net seemed more like a last resort, a desperate measure in case someone else tried to jump. It didn't appear to be part of any viable rescue plan. We could see a large group of people arguing heatedly below. It was a mix of family members, firefighters, and park employees, all with their own desperate ideas. The ride stretched into its 3rd hour. As the swing entered the loading area again, I saw a woman break free from the people holding her back and run towards the control panel. She was screaming and sobbing uncontrollably. It had been difficult to understand anything people shouted as we swung past, but her cries were clear. As we passed, I saw she had managed to reach the panel. I wasn't particularly worried. Whatever button she intended to press, I doubted it would work, given that nothing else had. We were just seconds away from the next descent when we heard a distinct click from all our restraints. The woman had hit the emergency release button. The restraints had worked perfectly. The brakes hadn't. A few people reacted quickly, either jumping out and hoping for the best or managing to re-secure their restraints before the swing began its descent. Others weren't so lucky. 3 people jumped, but none of them survived. Despite the net, one struck a support beam on the way down, and the other 2 landed awkwardly, their bodies twisting in unnatural ways. They died instantly. I'd estimate that about half of us remaining managed to re-engage our restraints before the swing went down again. The rest of us held on for dear life. I was among those who couldn't. I felt my stomach lurch as I instinctively reached up, grasping for anything to prevent me from being thrown out. The restraint wasn't entirely useless. It still provided some resistance, but there was a significant gap between my chest and the bar. I dug my fingers into the plastic, praying it would hold. Then we dropped. I felt myself lift off the seat. I tried to wrap my legs around the base of the carriage to keep my body from flying out. Ethan, who had managed to re-secure his restraint, tried to brace me with his arm and leg. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to pull the restraint back down over my chest. I couldn't tell who else had managed to do the same, but the terrified cries from some of the other passengers told me it wasn't everyone. My gaze was fixated on the upcoming loop. As we approached it, I could hear frantic shouts and curses from several passengers, including the woman in front of me. She was still desperately trying to free herself from her restraint. I could only hope the centrifugal force would keep her in her seat. As we went through the loop, I closed my eyes, unable to bear witnessing what I knew was coming. I heard screams and sickening cracking sounds. I couldn't be sure of the exact number, but I'd guess only 7 of us were still alive after that loop. I could see the 2 people in the front row and Ethan beside me. I could hear only 3 other voices behind us. By hour 5, 3 more people had died. 2 from apparent medical emergencies, their hearts giving out under the strain. The third, he had witnessed the person beside him die during one of the swings. He'd screamed in anguish, and then, I'd rather not describe it. He died soon after. They were the 2 people directly in front of Ethan and me. By hour 6, a group of people arrived with another large net, this one intended for the loading area. The whiteboard message changed. Manual stop in progress. I had no idea what that meant, but the sight of the net filled me with dread. The next time we passed, there were people on both sides of the platform. One side had a large pole anchored in the concrete, with the net attached. The other side had a similar pole, but the net wasn't yet secured. As we swung by, I could hear the frantic activity behind us. We rounded a turn, and I craned my neck to see what they were doing. They were desperately trying to attach the other side of the net to a newly installed support beam. The whole plan seemed insane. How could they possibly think this would work? Was this a last-ditch effort? I screamed at them to stop, but of course they couldn't hear me. Even if they could, they likely wouldn't have listened. They were desperate to save someone, anyone. Or perhaps the park owners were willing to sacrifice us all to prevent further scrutiny. As we swung past the final bend, the crowd below erupted in cheers and applause. They seemed oblivious to the flaws in this desperate plan. We were on the straight section, and my heart pounded in my chest. The few seconds before we hit the net felt like slow motion. I could see the faces in the crowd. They looked hopeful. I couldn't believe it. I knew they were about to be terribly disappointed. Finally, we hit the net. As expected, it was no match for the momentum of the massive swinging structure. The metal pole anchoring the net was ripped from its concrete base, crashing down between our carriage and the one behind us. As we began the next ascent, we desperately tried to dislodge the net, which had become entangled with our carriage. We managed to free ourselves from the netting, but the metal pole remained lodged in the ride's structure. As we swung down again, the entire ride began to vibrate violently. It felt like we were about to be thrown from the tracks. We made it to the first turn. There was a deafening snap, followed by 2 more screams. The 7 carriages behind ours had broken free, the metal pole acting as a fulcrum. As we turned, I watched in horror as the detached carriages flew off the track, plummeting 50 feet to the ground. The screams ceased abruptly as they crashed. My imagination filled in the gruesome details. Then there were 2. We hoped the ride would somehow stop or at least slow down now that it was lighter. It didn't. After another hour, there was no change. By hour 8, we had resigned ourselves to our fate. We just hoped it would be quick. Over the next few hours, we noticed a piece of metal on the carriage in front of us starting to wobble. It kept threatening to detach, and we braced ourselves each time. It eventually came loose. But it wasn't the dramatic, decapitating event we had feared. It was worse. The metal only partially detached, grinding against the track with a deafening screech. The sound was horrifying. The jagged metal began to work its way under our carriage. Ethan, fearing it would derail us, decided to try and grab it. I begged him not to. After several more laps of pleading, he made up his mind and contorted his body to reach for the sharp metal. I couldn't see his hand, but I saw his face. His expression shifted from intense focus to blank shock. Then he lifted his arm. I'll never forget the sight of his mangled forearm. The metal had sliced deep, tearing through flesh and muscle, exposing bone. I tried to grab his shoulder, but he was eerily calm. He was more silent than he'd been all day, almost mesmerized by the grotesque sight of his own injury. I felt lightheaded, a ringing in my ears. I watched his blood begin to flow, down his body onto me, pooling on the floor of the carriage. The sight of it sloshing around with each swing made me nauseous. Within minutes, Ethan looked like a ghost. I tried to fashion a makeshift bandage from shreds of my shirt, but it was futile. A piece of fabric was no match for exposed bone and torn flesh. I tried to talk to him to comfort him, but he drifted in and out of consciousness. As we began another ascent, he finally looked at me. I can't describe the look in his eyes, a mixture of pain, sadness, and a strange sense of resignation. He knew he was dying. I don't think he even cared anymore. He gave me a weak nod and looked forward as we began our descent. I tried to keep an eye on him during that lap, but it was almost unbearable. I heard him take a final, shuddering breath just before we entered the loop. When we emerged on the other side, he was gone. I was now alone in the rolling death trap. I never imagined things could get any worse, but sharing a carriage with a dead body on a malfunctioning ride was a new level of horror. I sat in shock next to Ethan's lifeless form for what felt like hours. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to even contemplate escape. Eventually, I managed to rouse myself. I realized the ride was moving just slightly slower. It was almost imperceptible, but the loops were taking a fraction of a second longer. That loose piece of metal that had killed Ethan must have lodged itself somewhere beneath the carriage, acting as a crude brake. I took off my shoes and then removed Ethan's. I had a desperate, probably foolish plan. If I was going to die, I wanted to at least try to control my own fate. As we swung past the loading platform again, the ride slowed noticeably just before the ascent. I threw all 4 shoes onto the track in front of the carriage. One of them caught, wedging itself perfectly between the wheel and the track. The carriage shuddered, then came to a complete stop. I could feel the ride straining against the obstruction, almost pulsing, trying to break free. My body was screaming in protest. My shoulders were bruised and raw from the repeated impact of the restraints. My entire lower body ached from being confined to the hard seat for what felt like an eternity. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and with a desperate yell forced my body out of the restraint. My heart pounded as I felt the carriage begin to lurch forward again. I managed to squeeze free just moments before it regained full momentum. I jumped. I landed heavily on the safety net below, the impact jarring my already injured body. But I was down. I was off the ride. Nothing could be worse than what I had just endured. I lay there on the net, staring up at the sky in utter disbelief. I was still. I wasn't moving. The stillness itself almost made me feel motion sick, like when you've been reading in a car for hours and then look up. Everything was blurry. I could barely hear the faint sounds of people rushing towards me. All I could hear was the ringing in my ears and the frantic beating of my heart. Within minutes, they got me down. I was immediately rushed to the hospital, where I spent the next 3 weeks. I had a broken rib, a broken collarbone, severe bruising, and a concussion, among other injuries. And then there was the invisible trauma, the psychological scars that would likely never fully heal. I'm writing this now years later because I finally feel ready to share my story. This is the first time I've allowed myself to fully revisit those memories. I've been working with a therapist and she encouraged me to get it all out. Don't bother trying to find any news reports about this incident. The park owners, a large corporation with deep pockets and well-connected lawyers, have done an incredibly thorough job of suppressing it. There were NDAs signed, settlements reached, and a quiet, almost invisible campaign of misinformation to discredit any rumors. That's another reason I feel compelled to tell my story. They've erased it from the public record, but I will not let them erase it from my memory. Even with therapy, some sounds and images are permanently burned into my mind. Ethan's last breath, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground, the grinding of metal against metal. If you take one thing away from my experience, let it be this: trust your instincts. Even if you don't believe in some higher power or gut feelings, listen to that inner voice. If something feels wrong, don't ignore it. It might just save your life. And that's the end of Full Swing. In the end, the park's negligence left scars deeper than anyone could have imagined. The thrill of the ride turned into a nightmare, and the past refuses to stay buried for those who survived. If tonight's story left you breathless, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more haunting tales. Until next time, remember, the line between excitement and terror is razor thin, and sometimes it's far closer than we think. This is the Midnight Narrator signing off, but always watching from the shadows.